Welcome to the Helmut Newton Foundation in Berlin. My name is Matthias Harder. I'm the curator and director of this institution. The exhibition Helmut Newton Legacy is the biggest ever in our house, with a lot of new works you have never seen before. We are now here in the first room called Early Years. So we start with this incredible photographic work of Helmut Newton, not with too many pictures, since lots of the early pictures are lost. So we had to go into the archive a lot, and we found incredible pictures from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the late years. Helmut Newton was commissioned by so many magazines and clients, and he was working until the end of his life. Such a work is unrivaled. So we gave the exhibition as well a chronological order. We start with the first room called Early Years, going back to the 1930s as Helmut Newton did the first self-portraits in Eva Studios, where he was trained as a young photographer in Berlin in the age of 16. Sometimes you see new prints as well as a lot of vintage prints we brought up from the archive into the exhibition rooms. Earlier on, we used as well wallpaper to enlarge the images and the motifs. As well, here you see great fashion shot from 1955, a woman with this huge head, and in the background there's a man, the tuxedo actually, but just reduced to the black silhouette. And you find this idea of the man as a prop, as an extra, as we would be in the film, a lot in his work in these early years, but as well later on. He stays with this idea. He came from Berlin through Trieste. Afterwards, he lived in Singapore a little bit, then in Australia, where he opened a fashion photos and a portrait studio. Then he went to, in 1956, to London, doing a lot of shots there. And from 1960 on, he lived in Paris, where he found his style in a way. And these early years, sometimes we are here in the 50s and sometimes in the early 60s, you see where he was putting a very certain idea of photography and fashion photography and speaking about the women in the frame. On the right side, a picture of a woman embracing herself, and she's in the background as well as a wallpaper. So the idea of the wallpaper is reproduced in a way here on the picture, which we have as well in the exhibition. If we go on, we see the very early storytelling, sometimes in just one frame. Sometimes he used a series of 6, 8 pictures, an incredible series of a woman. She was probably smuggling something, and she was controlled by the police. Her papers, her ID were checked. From frame to frame, she was changing the dress. And this is all about, it's just about fashion photography, the different styles, the different couturiers, of course. It was a series he did on the French-Belgian border in 1962 for the French Vogue. Of course, we encounter him as well. Him and his wife, June. You can't think about Helmut without June, of course. So the two portraits here, the portrait June shot of him, 1958, with a double lens Raleigh flags, and we see her shot by him as Hedda Gabler. So we see June Newton here as June Brown, the actress. As you know, she was a trained actress. You see his wife, and you see a woman. So everything is one more or less, but you can't decide between, let's say, June Newton as the wife and the actress. And this kind of role play is a very important part in his fashion and society photography, glamour photography, portrait photography as well in the future. A lot of vintage prints here on this extra wall, starting 1936. It's fantastic, actually. Both are indoor pictures. This is just the illusion of the background with the stones. You can't decide where reality starts and fiction ends. In between, there are several portraits Helmut took of June and June took of Helmut. And so these are part of the great exhibition, us and them, we were showing before 2 times at the Helmut Newton Foundation. We have now as well the ingredients of his very early work. It's fashion. We have the distribution and the publishers like Condé Nast, where he worked for, French Vogue, of course. This was the most important fashion magazine by then. But later on, as you will see, he worked as well for other magazines like Elle, Queen Magazine, and so on. Around the corner, you see color pictures, which is a kind of astonishing because the magazines by then were actually not able to print these. This is very early, and the color pages in fashion magazines were very expensive to produce. But as you can see, Helmut used color films in the early 60s, like here. Going back to Australia, by the way, and shooting for American Vogue in Australia. So by then, in the early 60s, he lived already in Paris. He was going back and forth the continent. He came to Australia in 1941, joining the army, and he lived there and opened his studio in 1945 in Melbourne, in Flinders Road. And the first pictures were published in Australian Vogue, which is a supplement of the British Vogue. On the left side, another fashion picture. We don't know where it was shot because we have just found the negative in our archive. It's a beautiful fashion portrait here in the woods. It might be around 1960. And on the right, this big extra wall with a wallpaper shot 1962 in Rio. Another fashion picture on the side with a woman in this white shirt and skirt with a white Porsche in the back, actually his Porsche, and the birds. It's a very dramatic scene. It could be, let's say, the first filmed scene by Hitchcock. You will see this later on as well. Vintage prints from the time here for Queen Magazine and British Vogue. People, 2 women, 1 man, which was incredible by then. Actually a no-go. It was not on. It was very naughty to realize such a situation. Here again, 2 women, 1 man on a horse. And all the time we have to think this is just about fashion photography. But we see here a narrative. We see here a story. It's something is added. So this is more or less the first step in his work. Yeah, it's an empty room, the first steps, and then we enter into the next exhibition rooms now with a bluish tone, the 60s. Every tone in the exhibition refers a little bit to the time the pictures were shot, kind of the style question. We find a lot of these colors in fashion of the years. First of all, we see this incredible series of the same model 5 times for Courage. Actually, it was shot in 1964 for the British magazine Queen. So Newton was using a very reflecting surface that doubles the figures, and it was an incredible series. And you can see that he needed a kind of a sparring partner with his fashion photography, and later on he did these incredible congenial pictures in fashion. So the designers were doing revolutionary fashion, and Helmut was hired by the magazines, being asked to do an adequate picture, his interpretation of the contemporary fashion. Here in the 60s, you already see the master. He found a style, he had incredible, very creative ideas, and he always found somebody else on the other side of the table, the editor-in-chief, for example, who was convincible by Helmut Newton with his unusual ideas. You see the doppelganger motif, for example. He was very interested in doubling the model with a store dummy. You see fashion by Karl Lagerfeld, and the man could be out of a René Magritte painting. And you see, obviously, a Hitchcock scene just brought into the fashion scenery, shot nearby London in the mid-60s. Here as well, there could be a reference to Alfred Hitchcock and his film Psycho. So Newton worked a lot with this. It's always these references to the idea of the suspense. And the quote says, "My photography is like film noir, like Pulp Fiction." So he was inspired by cinema a lot, and he was creating the fashion photography with this idea, from Hitchcock to Fellini and Truffaut and several of these filmmakers from the 60s and later from the 70s. In some rooms, you see vitrines, and within the vitrines, kind of a genesis of his work. Magazines, contact sheets, Polaroids, and so on, explaining a little bit about the context of the pictures as he shot them. On this extra wall, a series of 4 pictures. Actually, the series is a little bit bigger. And on the screen, you see King Kong. The funny thing here is he's not encountered with any respect anymore. So there is no fear from the women's side anymore. And there's a little tiny ape on the band. This shows us a lot about this kind of revolutionary idea Newton brought into the fashion world. These very self-conscious women playing around with this kind of encounter, with the idea of construction sites. And in one case as well with Marlon Brando behind her staying on a car. Very unusual for this time. It's if you compare it with other photographers from the 1960s. All of these pictures were just shot on commission of magazines. Therefore, we put some of these into the vitrine that the visitor of our exhibition see where the picture was printed and the idea was distributed. And now an exhibition like this in the year 2022, it's completely different that the pictures appear here in these sizes differently as photographic prints. But it's a long way, actually, from the 1960s working for magazines and going into an exhibition 60 years later, so that you can see these timeless pictures. Now into the next compartment of this 1960 room. It's black and white photography again, so you can see you work in series and in singles. So sometimes there was the idea of going with a fashion designer somewhere on the commission of an editorial into a city like Venice or Rome or Tunisia and several other places. But of course, Helmut Newton shot a lot in Paris, where he lived from 1961 onwards. If this show will travel, the first stop will be Knocke, then we will go to Vienna and later on to Milan and Venice. The show will look different. But now we are here in Berlin at the Helmut Newton Foundation, and the show was created for these spaces, which I know quite good after 17 years being the curator. I created a wall like a cloud. So every picture is at its own. But on the other hand, it's like as you would flip to the pages of a magazine, one after the other. Sometimes I have just pictures besides each other. Sometimes we have a series of 4 pictures. It depends. We have to react onto the room, the idea of the architectural possibilities. A quote, fashion pictures rarely have any logic, Helmut Newton said. Each one is a moment without a beginning or an end. So he was creating some situations. These are reenactments in a way because he saw similar situations, in reality, and then he was just repeating them in front of his camera with the models on a special site. But always, it's just about the dress. We have a lot of narratives here, we have a lot of storytelling, but leaving this room of the 60s, we have to be reminded that everything is just about fashion in that room, besides all the narratives. This orange room of the 70s, you see a change. Now he opens up the idea of fashion photography to something else. So we encounter here a lot of portraits for the first time. Actually, we saw the very early portraits and the reciprocal portraits of Helmut and June from the 50s onwards. So they were shooting themselves from time to time. Here we see portraits of Mick Jagger, Romy Schneider, June again, Jenny Kapitein, Andy Warhol, and so on. So these pictures were commissioned. In the case of June Newton after dinner, 1972 in Paris, the first nude actually in his work. So these pictures were commissioned by the magazines. Funnily, the Warhol picture was not shot for a society magazine, or as well, it was shot for Vogue Uomo because he wears here a leather dress designed by Yves Saint Laurent. And we have Catherine Deneuve, we have Charlotte Rampling, nude, shot 1973 in Arles. And then we have Paloma Picasso and her husband, and then Loulou Le Falaise, the muse of Yves Saint Laurent. So what we can see here is the combination of fashion photography, portrait photography, and nude photography, sometimes just in one picture. So he was open up his repertoire using the different genres, but telling again a lot of great stories, as we can see here in another cloud of pictures of these enlargements for the exhibition, or as well part of the exhibition, World Without Men. By the way, the 4th book printed in the early 80s. So, but here in the room of the 1970s, I have to say something about the prints and as well the distribution of the prints, which were a little bit different because he started to publish his own books. Everything started in 1976. He was 56 years by then, with a first publication called White Women. 2 years later, there was a publication, Sleepless Nights. These two became very famous. They won prizes. They were in different printing houses and publishing houses in different languages. It was an enormous success. For the first book, he was doing just the Newton version of a certain fashion photography and then including into the book. And for the second book, he was using and reprinting the pictures that were already published in magazines like Playboy. Because he started in the mid-70s as well his collaboration with men's magazines like Playboy, We, and so on. So he was working for different media. It was very astonishing. Flipping to the page of the publication Sleepless Nights, you see one picture on the extra wall with two store dummies. But you see this just in the second sight, that these are not real. We have always the question where reality starts and the fiction begins, or the reality ends and the fiction begins in the work of Helmut Newton. And these kind of revolutionary pictures, from the mid-70s, sometimes nudity a little bit included into this fashion world, sometimes it's just about this kind of aggression from the women's side. These pictures you will find as well in our book, in the accompanied book, Helmut Newton Legacy, of course, but we're finding these already in the second publication he did in 1978. Here we have two pictures of Jerry Hall, which was the former wife of Mick Jagger, who hangs opposite on the other wall. She was a model, of course, so we use the right picture where she bites into the cheek of the man for our current poster, which is now in several places here in Berlin. If we have the full-size picture just with a black frame, that's a new print. And sometimes if you have this kind of passepartout, you have a vintage print, sometimes a unique one. In this case, where you can see now a little bit with the faded colors, these are Kodachrome prints. Very valuable. We don't bring out of Berlin anymore. We just show them here. Also something about the fading of the time, fading of the colors, and speaking about the change of photographic prints and photographic quality and the fading of the information, which we see a lot in color photography from that time. We have this incredible murder series shot in 1975 and other nude pictures from Paris. So if you go around the corner, we see two women staying in the streets of Paris. This was shot under the title Love for Sale for Playboy magazine. This is a kind of street photography, and within the first compartment of that room, I displayed three different styles of street photography. You have this one, of course, these are not real prostitutes, they're just playing prostitutes within the streets of Marais, where Helmut Newton lived. Then you have the very famous picture called Rue Ouvriot with a tuxedo, or actually it's a suit made for women. It reminds us, of course, to Marlene Dietrich. And this was shot during the night. She waits for somebody, and you have always the combination of seduction in this picture, in this fashion photography, of course. But this is oscillating between the elegance and the decadence, because you are also reminded a little bit to Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's Cocotte pictures from Berlin. So this is an icon of fashion photography, a life-size print, as you can see here. And this is the second aspect of street photography within this room. Then you have a series of pictures shot in 1970 for Linea Italiana, an Italian fashion magazine, and of course here again just about fashion. And he added some paparazzi. We were the first exhibition house in Europe doing a show on paparazzi photography some years ago, because Newton was fascinated by the strength and the fastness of the paparazzi and the Schuspe, how they worked very quick. So this is again a kind of an homage to these real paparazzi he was using for these fashion shots in 1970 in Rome for Linea Italiana. Now we are leaving the 70s. So we go through the lobby of the Helmut Newton Foundation with the big nudes, and opposite this time not Sie kommen, they are coming, this famous diptych of the naked and dressed. But in this case, two huge collages on the spots opposite the big nudes, which you can find as well on our website. This again is a kind of journey into his work, a fantastic combination of magazines, vintage prints, nice quotes, and so on. Now, the other part. photographs from the 80s, the 90s, and the late years. Finally, we see as well June Newton with her work. Our former president, she died in April 21, so we used June's room for a little homage to June and her portrait photography. Now we are entering the rooms of the 80s. Helmut Newton changed his style a little bit and his genres. We already saw in the 70s that he worked a lot with portraits as well as nude photography. So we see this change here more radically. We see on the left side the very famous Ariel after haircut. In the huge room, other portraits and nude photography, a little fashion photography. The vitrine, which gives us a great context of the time with additional portraits, for example, his own magazine, which he published several times, called Helmut Newton's Illustrated, referring as well to the very early time as he grew up in Berlin in the 20s, referring to Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung. We saw other magazines like Stern, contact sheets, and work prints of the series Naked and Dressed, and several other portraits and so on. We encounter here as well the famous couturier Karl Lagerfeld, and here in this very experimental picture from behind and looking in two mirrors just at himself, very critically in a way. Helmut is more or less hidden behind the camera and, within the room. So on the room here with this turquoise tone, more or less the tone of the 80s, we see other portraits like Hanashigula, shot in Munich. And on the other hand, Nastasia Kinski, shot in Hollywood with a Marlene Dietrich doll in her arms. And this is a kind of paraphrase of the very famous scene of Maria Lactans, which you can see in all these picture galleries all over the world. As well, David Bowie, Caroline of Monaco, and Villa Vigie with Karl Lagerfeld and more or less his entourage. And it's the idea to show where Helmut Newton lived now, in Monte Carlo. So he left Paris for southern France and he bought a flat and a huge house. He photographed from that on his fashion pictures and a lot of portraits in Monte Carlo and as well in Hollywood, where he lived the first months of the year. More or less the winter he spent in Chateau Marmont, this luxury hotel, and he met a lot of Hollywood stars within the hotel and photographed them on the commission of many magazines. But here in the main room, we see his nude photography from the early 1980s, all black and white. He did his third book, called Big Nudes, including the famous juxtaposition, Naked and Dressed, and as well with these very strong women, Henrietta as a model and Sylvia Goebel and others, sometimes life-size, these huge prints. So he changed a little bit his style as well because the art market was asking more or less him to bring photographs to be auctioned and to be offered in several galleries. So it's the change in structure of his work and playing around with the genres, as well offering different pictures as well to different magazines, even more than in the 1970s. Here is a series of the making of the big nudes. The show is traveling from Tonaca and to Vienna and Milan. Here for the Berlin presentation, I decided to have the making of, because we have the big nudes, the life-size ones, already as a permanent display in the upper lobby of the museum. The very famous diptych "Sie kommen," they are coming, which was realized in the Vogue Studios in 1981 in Paris, and opposite as well this naked and dressed idea, plein air, which was shot in Brescia. So we have these two ideas, outside and inside the rooms, and actually for Helmut Newton was a little bit conservative idea to go back into the studio, because he was working all the time within the street, within life, as he said, and shooting the women. And now he went back into the studio, and then he was doing this, supported by a lot of Polaroids by then, in 1981, commissioned by French Vogue. The shots in Brescia were commissioned for Italian Vogue. The idea of the naked and dressed changed more or less everything, because nudity became a very important part in his photography by then. 4 pictures, black and white, all of them. A very nice idea called After Velasquez on this extra wall. 2 times it's fashion photography, 1 time it's a portrait, and the last one it's a takeover from art history. After Velasquez, very famous painting of the Venus. So Newton took the idea and transferred it into fashion photography, or into nude photography here as well, with the same ingredients. Just he changed the idea of the mirror, where the Venus is looking into a television set. Opposite in the small extra wall, you have as well a lot of monitors. So he was playing around with this kind of technical aspects in photography and around photography. And we see here, he photographed himself naked as well as several other people in Hollywood. If we enter this tiny little compartment, we see body details. These 3 pictures are shot for Italian Vogue magazine in Bordighera in 1982. So this is as well another aspect. We have several times with the full body, and now we have just details of it, close-ups if you want. And actually behind this idea it's a commission for this editorial for makeup. So we can speak about fashion photography as well. Fashion is actually a huge area. You have this accessoires, jewelry, and as well these makeup pictures. Opposite wall, 2 other pictures shot a little later, color ones. And within the vitrine, you see the pictures were hanging here in the room as well. We have the contact sheets, the smeared lipstick picture, the color one, for example, hanging outside of the Hamburger Deichtorhallen, where an exhibition of Helmut Newton in the 90s were held. So everything is combined in a way. The cover of the German Max magazine with the diptych "Sie kommen," and so we have the "Sie kommen" inside the room, life size. Everything is in a way connected through the vitrines again. If we leave this 80s room, we go into a new area, a new time. It's just in the next decade, but Newton changed his style again. So he was following the zeitgeist, and sometimes he was ahead of it. So in the 80s, he published a lot of books Big News, for example, was very successful. Different publishing houses internationally in different issues. He sold 10,000s of copies of this book. His own magazine came out, Helmut Newton's Illustrated. In the 90s, it was going on as well with his publication, but he changed a little bit his style and he came back into the fashion photography. In this huge room, we see just fashion photography, like in the second room, the 60s room. Of course, sometimes it's a little bit connected with nudity. In this case, here for a French Vogue magazine, it's a Thierry Mugler fashion, and you see the same woman staying in front of this mirror. She's wearing the dress, sometimes she's just holding it over the arm and just wearing high heels, which is actually a quote back to the 80s. Self-appropriation, if you want. So he was taking again up this naked and dressed idea. And then sometimes it's just a lot of seduction in his pictures, looking from this kind of rock perspective. But as you can see, the surroundings are completely different from the ones in the 70s. Here you have the type of the femme fatale, just wearing this lingerie, which was shot for Thierry Mugler fashion, not commissioned by a magazine, but by the couturier himself. And you see a dead man laying on the ground behind her. So this reminds us a little bit of the early years and as well of the 60s and 70s. So he was repeating himself, but in a very creative way. So you have black and white and color photos side by side because he was using all the time the different films. In the vitrine, in the ground floor, in the permanent display called Helmut Newton's Private Property, you see the different cameras with a BW and with a C for color. So he was using different camera bodies with different films for the job. Sometimes he was shooting both black and white and color, commissioned by the magazines or by the designers. As you can see here as well in the room, of course, the magazines were able and willing to publish color pictures by then, but sometimes he was going back into the black and white photography and then he forced them to reproduce his pictures in the timeless classical black and white to transfer his interpretations and visions of contemporary fashion in this way. He was always doing something special. He was always doing something which was really astonishing. For example, here the fashion pictures as vintage prints again, so that the trousers are a little bit too much up at the last picture, shot in Monte Carlo again. He liked the commissions of the fashion designers and the commercial photography. Once we did a show called Gun for Hire. This was actually our third or fourth show here at the Helmut Newton Foundation in the year 2005 and 2006. And now we are preparing a new show on this commercial photography. And sometimes you see it here already, that you see pictures, they were shot for the designers and other clients like Cleve Apples or Wolford or Lavazza and so on. Blue Marine here, the color one. Most of these pictures were shot in Monte Carlo in the nearby area because he lived there since 1981. So he used these kind of contrasts of the concrete backgrounds as well with the fashion of the time. This was completely different from the time of the 70s when he was using luxurious hotels, lobbies, the flats of the rich people, friends, the pools and so on. So this was just concrete, sometimes his garage. Then he went to Berlin, for example. He shot for his Zeit magazine the cover with a lady directly here on the former border. So he went for another job with models with the bikinis into the desert. Then he was shooting for Wolford and other clients. We have a lot of commercial photography and editorial photography. Actually, you don't see any big difference between these two worlds. It's two worlds because normally the photographers are working either for this area or the other, and they make a difference for these two jobs. And in the case of Helmut Newton, it's different. Again, if we go into this little corridor with just 3 huge black and white pictures, we see a little bit the dark side. So now we are in his last years. This was a shot where we look at Leaving Las Vegas is the title. So it's becoming dark. It's a kind of a farewell picture shot in the late 90s. Or if we see here the two dark nudes shot in the year 2002 in Milan in two different hotels. One model is just illuminated by the TV screen, again a TV screen which we saw already in the 1980s, now in the making of the big nudes, and opposite with the after Velasquez idea. So we have the nude here, but it's dark. It's a kind of a farewell. It's different from the other pictures. So we have in these last rooms, the 90s and the late years, we have the farewell picture here on that side, two nudes, and then we have in the huge back room just fashion photography. So we put the nudes a little bit on the side, and in the other corridor we added a lot of portraits, because the idea that it's going on with all the three genres to all the time. So from the 50s, 60s and 70s you have as well a little bit the portrait idea. Nude photography started in the 70s, and fashion photography is the main part of Helmut Newton's work, obviously. So he was commissioned by so many magazines until the end of his life. And this is very unusual, actually, for this very fast fashion business. Normally, you have a fashion photographer who has a kind of a peak, and then he will start to be forgotten. This is really different in Helmut Newton's case. He was publishing his fashion pictures, his portraits, and his nude pictures in so many magazines until his death. He's probably the most published photographer of all times. Besides that, he did a lot of own publications, and if he did an exhibition somewhere, there was always the exhibition catalog accompanied. His work is distributed in these different channels. Actually, everything started as editorial pictures, sometimes for some free project like the big nudes, but normally he was commissioned by magazines and other clients. This is the same case as we have with Irving Penn, and Richard Avedon, and Peter Lindbergh, and some other of the fashion photography stars. But in the case of Helmut Newton, it's an enormous photographic work he created between 1936 and 2003, as the last pictures were taken in Monte Carlo. And then he left for Berlin, bringing everything on track for his own foundation, where we are now. And then he died in January 2004 in Los Angeles. The next show we are going to produce, it's a show about Hollywood. It's about the Chateau Marmont, where he photographed, where he stayed from 1980 onwards, where some of these pictures were taken as well. In this last room, you see a lot of pictures from Monte Carlo, as I said. So this was his main quarter. He was just going down from his apartment house, and then he was shooting fashion with his different surroundings, sometimes construction sites and very strange combinations of the fashion and the surrounding. In this little corridor, we see some of his late portraits from the 90s. It's Ettore Sottsass, it's Anselm Kiefer, it's Gianni Versace, it's Arthur Miller. And opposite, we have some more fashion photography. Sometimes you can't believe that's fashion photography, like the one with a chicken. This is an editorial about jewelry, this incredible ring and bracelet. Of course, Helmut Newton added a nice story into this idea. And when we add here the whole contact sheet, the visitor can, let's say, control and understand the idea of the shooting. This is interesting to combine and to compare these two pictures. The real picture, actually, which was published in French Vogue in 1994, and the contact sheet he did before. The same thing you see as well in the vitrines, as I said. So this is always a kind of a genesis. You're so into his work. And this was our whole idea about this show called Legacy. We brought up new pictures like the ones you see here. This is a fashion picture for Prada. This is for Thierry Mugler in the center. And then it's Iri Ishida, the famous Japanese actress, and Newton did a book on her. Everything is fashion-based. It's opposite the portraits from the same time. And these two ones, Maria Casares and Arthur Miller, have a very certain calmness. They are very contemplative people. This is not such an enactment, not such a mise en scène which he was using normally. Now we go into the last room, and this is kind of a homage to June Newton, who passed away in April 2021, our former president, Helmut's widow. And so we add here a quote by June. Helmut is a great manipulator. He loves the theatricity of photography, and including these portraits of Helmut. If we enter into June's room, as you might know, June Newton became famous under her pseudonym Ella Springs. She is a trained actress from Australia, and there was this game with putting a pin into the Australia map, and then the needle landed into the city of Alice Springs, and this was her name as a photographer. Vintage prints with a passepartout, different people from Hollywood and several other places. It's Fanny Ardant, it's colleagues, Sebastião Salgado. Sometimes you encounter the same people you saw already at the big exhibition of Helmut Newton. It's Catherine Deneuve, who you see here in a very different way. Sometimes it's a kind of enactment, but normally it's an incredible, neutral, open atmosphere in her portraits. She was very able to catch a very certain moment to photograph them. All these portraits, or most of them, are part of the exhibition Us and Them. There is a portraits which we saw already in the first room of the Helmut Newton retrospective legacy in the early years room, and then we see the them part. It's us and them, so it's always a photograph by Helmut and by June of the same person. So you can see here Gianni Versace, who we saw outside. We see Hanna Schygulla, who we saw outside as well, and several other fashion people like Telly here on the right side. And more people from fashion industry, from Hollywood. Helmut and June spent all the winter time every year in Hollywood, and both of them took portraits of the people living there. So putting everything later on into their common book, Us and Them, which was published and exhibited in the late 90s as well in our foundation. Yves Saint Laurent here, for example, with a bigger print. Azedine Alaya, Nikiti Sanfal, Mostly all of them were photographed as well by Helmut. And then we have within the project, us and them, the juxtaposition of these two people, if you want. Actually, it's the same person, but we see them very different, in a very different manner, very neutral, completely open-minded here, as June would open their soul, photographing not them just with their skin and just with the outer part, but as well looking into their soul. Helmut Newton said once that he is not interested in the soul of the people, but sometimes you see in his portraits as well the same idea. And so therefore the juxtaposition of Helmut's and June's portraits are so eye-opening in a way. Karl Lagerfeld, who we saw outside, Florentine Pabst, and then again Yves Saint Laurent and Pierre Berger, here shot in Paris in the 80s. So it's an incredible sight June Newton took of the people she encountered. It's more or less the idea of she meets them and have just 5 minutes than doing the shoot as it would be just a tiny little break in the conversation. It's incredible how a person, if you're alone in this room, looked at these people and how open their eyes are. And then this encounter you can feel in this room. If we leave June's room again, we end up here with a portrait June took of Helmut. Again here, kind of a farewell picture. June took this close to Chateau Marmont in 1996. And Helmut shoots back at her and probably at us.